Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to talk about what causes anxiety. And so this stems from a Facebook video that I saw, and it comes from Alex Korb. He's got a PhD, and he studies anxiety depression. So we're going to break down that video, and I will also have that video. It's a Facebook video, so I'll have it posted in our show notes, and then we're also going to go through it. But before we do that, I want to distinguish the difference between anxiety as an emotion and anxiety as a disorder, because one is helpful and as actually can be kind of a good thing, and the other one is not.
Yeah. So I just want to say before we get to that, I think the video is worth watching. It's only about 8.5 minutes long, and he gives some good information.
Oh, okay. So there's two videos we're going to reference. So there's the one where he talks. Okay. So the first one that we're going to break down is he's talking about the real cause of anxiety. And then the second video that we're also going to reference is he does an entire TED talk about strengthening brain circuits to help with anxiety. Right. So I will have both of those posted in our show notes.
Okay. So let's go to what's the difference between anxiety as an emotion. I would use a different word.
Okay.
I would say I'm anxious. As opposed to I have anxiety. I think these are pretty well accepted definitions that I'm going to give. I think anxiety for me is the physical manifestation of the mental component, which is fear or worry. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we're talking about it as emotion, you could say, well, I'm really anxious today. And I think what one is saying is you might feel jittery in your body, or maybe your breathing is a little bit different, and it's probably because you're worried. Maybe you've got a test you're going to take or a presentation you're going to make at work, and you could be a little bit anxious. And I think that would be more the emotion.
Yeah.
Anxiety as a disorder, though, which is true for a lot of mental health issues, is that it becomes a disorder when it's disruptive in your life.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you think about, we all have some narcissistic qualities, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's good to have a healthy ego, but if it becomes so extreme that it disrupts your life, then it becomes a disorder. And so the same is true with, an anxious disorder. I would say the most common diagnosis, at least from the DSM-5, you might have heard the term GAD, G-A-D, generalized anxiety disorder is probably the most common. But this is one of the times I'm going to describe a graph, and I know that's hard to do when no one can see what I'm doing. But I think that there's a pretty well-known graph that if as anxiety increases, your productivity increases also, until you hit a point where the anxiety is so high that your productivity does a nosedive. And so it's like, if you can imagine that graph, there's this sweet spot where anxiety serves a purpose, which I think is what you were getting at. That, for example, if you aren't anxious about the test tomorrow, you probably aren't going to study. And so the anxiety serves to motivate you to do something. But if the anxiety becomes too big, then often you become frozen. And for a lot of people, if you cross over into that anxiety as a disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, then often what happens is it's affecting their daily life.
Yeah.
They say there's a social anxiety component, then they tend to isolate. They don't go out. And that becomes a problem, say, if they're partnered with someone who really does like to go out. And so it becomes this conflict. I want to stay in, but what's keeping them in is generally anxiety about being out there. And so that's when it becomes disruptive. Is that a good distinction? Good enough distinction between the two?
Oh, yeah. And I think that's very helpful because, when you feel anxious and you're feeling that emotion, it's going to cause you to act. And so, a little bit of anxiety can be it's a good thing, right?
It's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like a little bit of stress, right? I mean, because if we never felt stressed about anything, we wouldn't get anything done. I mean, if you have a deadline at work, then you're going to feel pressure to get it done on time. That's that stress, that's anxiety. But when it can cross over and it gets too big that you're unproductive, then it can fall into a disorder. And it's not that you can't have certain situations where you cross into that, or you can cross into that like your productivity takes a nosedive, or you can have a certain situation where you just get so anxious and so worked up that you lose all productivity. You can have an instance like that and not be diagnosed with a disorder.
That is certainly true, but I think that, if let's say you're in that situation where occasionally your productivity takes a nosedive, I think you really need to listen to what's going on within and do something about it, which I think we're going to get to in a few minutes. What are the things that you can get to? But you shouldn't just say, oh, I'm not going to be productive or I'm too anxious. You should do something about it.
Right, exactly. And the important thing too with an anxiety disorder, and when people say it's all in your head, just because it's originating in your head doesn't make it invalid. And so that's why I really like your description of it's the physical manifestation.
Yeah.
Because anxiety, people who have genuine anxiety and debilitating anxiety, they will feel physical manifestation. Their heart, it feels like their heart is pounding. They can even get a stomach ache or stomach pain. So it can certainly be debilitating.
Yeah, and so I would like our listeners to be able to say anxiety's not all in your head, it's all in your body.
It is. Yes.
And so it's a good way to think about it. Like if you have trouble breathing, or if you have tight chest or sore shoulders or the stomach's pretty, that's pretty common. Listen to your body because it's telling you something important.
Yes. Okay, so Alex Korb, he goes into the causes of anxiety. And so he starts off by saying that people think that anxiety is caused by an external source. So, such as, a job or a relationship or school or some external factor that is causing their anxiety. And as a result, they spend a lot of time and effort trying to change those external factors. And there may be some external factors that you can modify or you can change, but what really causes the anxiety or what is causing the anxiety is the way your brain is reacting to uncertainty. It's the way your brain is reacting. So those external sources are not the cause of your anxiety. They are the trigger of your anxiety. They are triggering your anxiety. And so you can literally rewire your brain to react differently to uncertainty. Right?
Yeah, I think I like the word uncertainty. I think that's pretty accurate. I think it's a pretty fine distinction, though. I agree with everything you've said, that the external event is the trigger.
Yeah.
But it seems like we're splitting hairs just to say, well, it doesn't cause it. It is the trigger that causes it. But I agree with you. It's the way our brain's wired. And that I think there are things that you can do to change the context of your life or the external stimuli that have been the trigger. But I do think you need to focus on that brain wiring. We're going to talk about what we know about how to rewire, because ultimately that's what you want to do, because otherwise you just keep having the same thing happen.
And, even if it is, say it's a job, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then, you might carry over into the next job, right? What I'm getting at is you can't avoid stress.
No, I think you're right. I agree with you. I think you're right. Let's say you're blaming it on the job. And so there's something on the job. Maybe your boss has been very nice to you, or whatever it is. You go to the next job, your chance of having a similar situation where you're going to be triggered again is pretty high.
Yeah.
And so you might be able to change it slightly by changing the context, but ultimately you've got to work on your brain, changing the wiring in your brain, which I really believe you can.
But it takes time and effort and
slow.
Consistency. Yes.
Absolutely. Those are, time, effort, consistency, all of those. And we live in a culture that I think focuses on quick fixes.
Yes.
Let's get the quick fix. Let's take the drug. Let's do something else. And there is not a quick fix to this.
No. Now, I mean, if your anxiety does get to a point where you're having just severe regular panic attacks and it's that debilitating, there are certainly things that you can do to help manage in the short term, right? Like if it
Right.
gets so debilitating, there are some medications that can be helpful, but I would hope that listeners would really look at that as more of a short-term solution so that you can get to a place of better equilibrium.
Right. And our listeners know, I'm kind of anti-drug, but you're absolutely right that there are situations where it is so debilitating you can't do anything, and so the drug itself helps you then calm yourself down so that you can actually make some real progress doing these other things. So there is a place for it. It's just I think it's overused. I think the drugs are overused and they're overprescribed, and we rely on them too heavily. But there is a place for it, certainly.
All right. So let's get into Alex Korb, his TED Talk. So the title is Simple Steps for Strengthening Your Brain Circuits of Resilience. And so what he is talking about is just simple things that you can do in your life that can help that rewiring of the brain. And so he gives a really good example of this person who she volunteered to receive these little shocks.
Yeah. Right.
And so, and again, she volunteered. That's important. And so they gave her warnings about that this was coming, and then they were watching the way that her brain reacted. And so her brain, she would start to feel that stress and that anxiety when she would get a warning that these shocks were coming. And then what they found is when she had a loved one there, so she could hold, or I think she was holding her significant other's hand, it calmed. So she still got all the same warnings, but it calmed the anxiety. Her brain reacted differently because her brain was just rewired because she had something comforting that helped calm her.
Well, your brain doesn't rewire that quickly.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I think what he would say is that the oxytocin. So we know that that skin-on-skin contact does release oxytocin. So there's a change in her brain just because having her loved one there touching.
Yeah,
is what I think. So in that particular case, it's not that she's rewiring the brain in that particular instant. There's something that's just overriding and helping her be calm.
Yes, and he talks about this idea of the touch of a loved one, which I think is a very positive thing. And we know that long-term relationships and relationships in general are what make us happy. But I do want to caution that should not be your only source of being calm, right? Like you should have other factors that are completely within your control, something that you can do independently, because you can't be dependent 24/7 on a loved one to help calm your anxiety. Does that make sense?
Right. And I'm trying to think about this. I don't know if the touch of a loved one would maybe long term it would help rewire your brain. I'm a little skeptical of that.
Okay.
I think that there are other things we're going to talk about that do. I think that the touch of a loved one is really calming in that moment. And so the reason you don't want to rely on that is you don't want to have to go everywhere you go that might be stressful with your loved one.
Yeah.
You want to be independent.
Yes.
And which is his point about being resilient. What are the things that you can do to increase your resiliency? So when I listened to that, I think he was just talking about the power of the neurotransmitter. I think he called the oxytocin the neurotransmitter. I don't know that it really is, but that doesn't matter. I think he was just pointing out the power of that to have influence on your brain, which it is. It's very powerful. I agree.
And it's a good thing, right? I mean, you should seek out relationships. It's just a relationship should not be your primary source of resolving anxiety. Okay. Yeah. So he brings up a couple of things, and he briefly just glosses over them, or he mentions them, right? So things like gratitude, sleep hygiene, mindfulness and deep breathing, meditation and exercise. These are all things that we've been talking about for 3 years now.
Yes. And all really important. And those are the things I am really convinced, and I think the research shows that long term it does change the wiring.
Yes.
That's now, here's how I described it before. And again, I want to say to listeners, this is not exactly what's going in your brain. This is how I visualize it. I visualize that limbic system, the amygdala, as being inflamed, but it's not really.
Yeah.
but that's how I see it. And that all these things, the meditation, the good sleep, the exercise, and even strong relationships tend to decrease the inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I want to point out that's not exactly what's happening.
And an
But
anti-inflammatory is
for me, it really fits. So
yes. So an anti-inflammatory is not going to reduce your
no,
amygdala.
no,
Don't
no.
try
So
that.
please don't think that. I like to simplify these because the brain is an incredibly complex organ,
Yes.
which is wonderful. And so when I'm explaining this to clients, I want to keep it simple, something that you can grab onto and really see. And so I think that those things do have a calming effect. The exercise in that video, he talks about his own struggle. Now I can't remember what it was he was anxious about. There was something it was he was right outside out of school, and he was looking for a job or going for a job, and so he was anxious. And he talks about how he went and started playing is it called ultimate frisbee?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I know what that is. It's kind of like a merger between frisbee and golf, I think.
I played it in cross country, and I mean I hated it, but that's because I have no hand-eye coordination. But it's just good exercise. You're running around a lot and throwing a frisbee, so it's a lot of running, and then you add in the throwing a frisbee, and it works your body physically, but it also can work your brain mentally, which can be really good for you. It gives your brain workout because you have to coordinate and think about where do I need to be to catch the frisbee and where do I need to throw it to catch the frisbee. These are all, and there's also, I would like to point out the social element of it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So,
and so I just think he kind of glossed over this. I mean, I agree with what he's saying, but I think it's really important to stress it's aerobic exercise. The three things we know, good sleep, good aerobic exercise, and some sort of meditative practice. And so the other thing that he talked about, he mentioned that being outside helps reset his circadian rhythm. Now, that is true, but what he neglected to talk about, and this is really important for listeners. And again, the research is very clear on this, that it is the time of day, and that what you want to do is be outside in the bright sunlight as early as you can in the morning.
Yes.
So it's not that it's not good for you to be outside. It's just if you really want to get that reset on your circadian rhythm daily, it's early in the morning.
So with the circadian rhythm, but just being outside in general is good for your health, for your mental health.
Absolutely. Do you remember I mentioned the book? I talked about this book a lot called Lost Connections by Johann. And he talks about, I think there are 9 different things that we become disconnected from. One of them is nature. Yeah. And so being outside, in nature is really important. The other thing you mentioned the social component of something like ultimate frisbee and, being disconnected from what he would call community. And the book itself I should mention, is talking about why is there an increase in anxiety and depression? Yeah. And he believes it's because we've become disconnected from these things. And Alex Gorb, what he is really talking about, using different words, is reconnection with some of these important things.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of these things together. And one thing that he said, I think is pretty important, and that is there's no one big solution to strengthening your resilience, right? It's kind of like there's no one size fits all treatment for anybody. And so, I mean, you can have great exercise or you can exercise very regularly and still have an anxiety disorder. That is possible.
It's a really good point to bring up. I think it's the little things. It's these daily positive habits that we need to incorporate in our lives, and I think it's really crucial. The good sleep, meditation. He calls it mindfulness. To me, they're synonymous. And what we have said before about mindfulness or meditation, that there is this whole range of acceptable practices that would be mindfulness or meditation. You just have to find what works for you.
Right.
And it's very much based on your individual feelings. So
And gratitude is another one that
Oh,
I
yeah.
really like because, when you tell somebody just, well, why can't you just choose to be happy? Happiness is a choice. Well, sometimes it's really genuinely hard to be happy. And that's not helpful to say that to anybody because sometimes I don't think you can choose to be happy. Sometimes I think your brain is genuinely unhappy, but you can choose to find positive things in your life to focus on. Right.
Right.
And so you can choose to find something to be grateful for and focus on that instead of this negative thing. Because I think sometimes awful things happen in our lives and there's a very good reason to be unhappy.
And that's true. I think what I've mentioned before is I think as we have evolved as a species, I think our brain is more easily focused on the negative.
Hmm.
And I really believe it's because it helps us survive,
Yeah.
because you're looking for anything that's going to go bad. And
Hmm.
what the gratitude practice does is it helps shift your focus, your brain's focus from the negative to the positive. And so if you've got a daily gratitude practice, I think what it does is it's almost like building up your system so that you can take the sadness, or you can that
Hmm.
because the sadness or the unhappiness will come,
Right.
because that's life. And it's great if you've had a life where you've always been happy,
I
but
don't know if that exists.
most people don't. And
No.
so I think if it's in my mind, it's the same thing with meditation, that you do it daily, and it really helps your mental attitude for the times when it does become stressful. And so a
Hmm.
lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, I'm feeling pretty good today, I'm happy, so I'm not going to meditate, I don't need it.
Hmm.
And it's really important daily practice of
Yeah.
meditation,
Yeah.
because it helps you to. I'll use the word that he used. I think it makes our brain more resilient,
Hmm.
and the resilience is you're building up these good things in your brain so that you can take the days that are unhappy, or you can take the days that are stressed, and you become more resilient and they don't bring you down.
Right. So, I mean, a good example of this I shared a few weeks ago. We did an episode on stress, and I talked about, this, oh man, just this 6 weeks of basically just hospital visits and just a lot of stress.
Yeah.
It was 2 straight months. And, during that time, I was still relatively happy, right? I
Hmm.
still like, I mean, there was moments that were certainly harder than others, but I still consider and shoot, I mean, I still have stressful things that are going on. So, and I attribute that in large part to my coping so well with this genuinely stressful and hard situation, to my nature to focus on the positive. And it's not that I've always, well, and I don't know, maybe you could just call it my disposition, but it's something that I've done for years is I have tried to focus on what I am grateful for and try to focus on looking for the positive, looking more for the positive. So you can change. You
Right.
can change it.
Right. You've trained your brain,
I
or
have.
you've
Yeah.
trained your brain to be more focused on that. But I think that it comes pretty naturally to a lot of people to look at the negative,
Yes.
but I think you can work on it daily. Gratitude practice is probably the easiest and I think a really good way to shift that focus to the positive. I always start I think I've said this before, every couple session, I always start by saying, tell me the positive, for you two in last week, because I want to train them to start looking at the good
Hmm.
things. Because even when the couples are struggling, there are still good things that happen during the week. It's just harder to see them.
Yes. So I have another good example of how I have been able to kind of rewire my brain. So I've shared recently about my meditative practice.
Hmm.
So with a heart rate monitor and lowering my heart rate, and a lot of it comes down to breathing. And
Hmm.
so a big part of that for me is listening to piano music. And so because I've been doing this for long enough now, piano music is a trigger to my body to immediately just be calm and to just relax. And so at any time now, if I'm just feeling anxious or feeling stressed about something, I can turn on piano music and I instantly start to feel calmer. And so, that's just an example of how you can rewire your brain. And I'm not genuinely a terribly anxious person, But, I still have things that trigger anxious feelings in me, as we all do. And so, listening to that piano music just instantly brings down my stress level immediately.
Yeah. But what you pointed out is really important, that over time, you can actually train your brain to react differently or almost immediately to it. The same thing is true of breathing. If you work at, breath work every day where you like you're saying, you bring your heart rate down, then often I think they've done this, that you can think about breathing in a different way and your heart rate starts to go down. It's really quite amazing, the connection between our brain.
Yeah, your brain and well, just how powerful your brain is and exactly, what it can accomplish. So let's talk about breathing and kind of how breathing directly affects your heart rate.
Okay. Here's what I've been taught, and I think this is true, that over time, as we've evolved, that when we get into an anxious situation, there's certain things that happen in our body that essentially are getting us ready to either run or fight or freeze, which are the response to a threat. And one of those things that happens, one of those physiological things that happens, start breathing shallow. Now, for me, shallow is more up in your chest. And that is the thing that if you have a tight chest, or often it'll go to your shoulders and your upper back, it's really connected to the way you're breathing. So again, if I have someone in my office and they're anxious, I'll have them stretch out and I have them put a hand on their chest and a hand on their stomach, and I just ask them to breathe. And you can see whether they have a shallow breath where their chest is moved, a deep breath where their stomach is more moving, the diaphragm, or what I call a split breath, which is both are moving. And it's amazing, someone who's pretty anxious and they're breathing shallowly all the time. And so what you can train yourself to do, I think all breath work is really about focus, but I think it's also getting a deep breath. And so the mistake that a lot of people make, and I'll say to a client, take a deep breath, and immediately their chest goes up, because they think, oh, I'm just taking a lot of air. That is not a deep breath. A deep breath is a diaphragm breath. And so a deep breath is where your chest doesn't move. And again, I wish I could show this, because you can actually train, like for me, I can breathe easily without, my chest is not moving at all. And I actually think it's a natural way for me to breathe, but I've been practicing this for many, many years.
Right.
And so what I try and help people do is to just practice the deep breath. And here's another thing, practice it several times a day, even when you don't think you need it, because what's happening is you're training your body to react to the breath. Just like you've trained your body to react to the music, you can train your body to react to the deep breath. And immediately, if you shift your breath and go to a deep breath, you calm down. But it takes, going back to what you said at the start, it takes effort, time, and consistency to do that.
Right. And so, we live in a world of quick fixes, but oftentimes those quick fixes aren't really fixes at all. And another thing too, so going back to this breath work, next time, because everybody, and maybe you don't experience this a whole lot, but everybody kind of has that sensation probably where they feel like they need to take just like a sudden deep breath. Next time you do that, where you take a sudden deep breath, just think about it. Think about the way your body moves, and you're probably breathing more from your diaphragm than you are from your chest when that happens.
Here's the other thing I want to say about breath work. There are a lot of different ways to breathe out there, and I think they're all good.
Well, breathing is important.
Well, yeah.
It's the oxygen that matters.
I'm bringing up one that is easy for me to teach to my client. There's a box breathing is one. Box breathing, I've never gotten into it. A lot of people do. Wim Hof breathing is named after a Dutch guy who developed it. Thich Nhat, who's the Vietnamese monk who was very much into meditation, deceased now. He wrote a whole book called Breathe, You Are Alive. And so it's all about breath work. So it's not necessarily that you have to do this one thing that I described, although I think it's effective. It's a lot like meditation. Find out what works for you.
Yeah. Right.
But focus on your breath I think is probably the takeaway. Focus on the breath.
And that's why, if you have somebody who is experiencing a panic attack, oftentimes what can be the most helpful is to calmly tell them, let's try to take some deep breaths, focus on your breathing, try to, don't tell them to calm down. It's not helpful. But if you often say, can I breathe with you? Right. Can I hold your hand and can I breathe with you to help you to feel more calm?
And depending on your relationship with the person, touching them is a really important thing to do.
Yeah. You can offer even just to hold their hand. That can be extremely helpful.
Right.
Okay. So next week, we are going to get into aggression. We've kind of talked about this a little bit before in the past, but we're going to really talk about aggression just kind of as an action, why it happens, where it originates, and what you can do if you are an aggressive person.
Right, but I think you ought to mention to the listeners the reason you thought this up, because
a
lot of people probably saw Travis Kelce at the Super Bowl.
Yep.
Let loose on his coach, I think is who it was. And so that's the first thing he said to me. But, did I see that act of aggression? So we can talk about that. And I came up with reasons that I think it happened. Just speculation, but kind of fun.
Well, we're going to psychoanalyze Travis Kelce, and psychoanalyzing people is
from
fun.
Afar.
From afar.
All
right.
Yeah, so we'll talk about aggression next week.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Oh, and we're probably going to have to bring back Will Smith and the infamous slap with Chris Rock.
That's a great one. That is a great one. Yeah.
So we're going to get into aggression, and we're also going to talk about, well, I shouldn't give away everything, but we're also going to get into how females can be aggressive too.
Right.
So, okay. All right. We will see you all next week.
Goodbye, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.